All right, ladies and gentlemen. For today's presentation, we're going to start talking about cells. Now, cells are the structural and functional unit of life, all right? And that's a really key idea, all right? Is that any living thing is made of cells. And any living thing that has structures that allow it to live, those structures are made of cells. So you talk about, your circulatory system, your respiratory system, your muscular system, all of those systems are made of structures that are made of cells. And so it's very important for us to really take a close look at the cells themselves so we can understand how it is that they allow us to create functioning life. Okay? And so the first step there is to look at the types of cells. Now, cells can fall into a huge collection of types. I mean, we could talk about prokaryotic, eukaryotic. We could talk about animal, plant, fungi. We could talk about cells that have a cell wall. We could talk about the different cells in the muscular system has striated cells and non-striated cells. And we could talk about the different cells that make up epithelial or connective tissue. Like, there's a broad variety of ways we could organize cells. But it's also very important to understand that cells fit into one of two categories. They are either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. And this is the most important place that we want to create organization for cells. So cells are either prokaryotes or eukaryotes. Okay? Now, prokaryote literally translates as before nucleus. All right? And eukaryote translates as true nucleus. And so the key here is, and ultimately one of the defining characteristics of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, is that eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells do not. Now that's not it. That's not the defining characteristic. But it is the easiest way for you to turn around and say, okay, prokaryotic, okay, eukaryotic, whether they have a nucleus or not. The real thing here is this. Prokaryotic cells have no membrane-bound organelles or membrane-enclosed organelles, but eukaryotics do, okay? So that's really the key. The rest of these things are all individual structures you can see, all right? Eukaryotic cells tend to have a single chromosome in this structure right here that we call a nucleoid, okay? Streaming in the cytoplasm means that there are structures that move rapidly through it, and because they don't have a complex cytoskeleton, that's not really possible. They do not undergo a process known as mitosis for cell division. We'll get into that after midterms. They have simple flagella, which is the structure you can see right here, meaning that the cytoskeleton aspect of it is not as complex as that in eukaryotic cells. They have ribosomes. This is a really important thing because people get confused because ribosomes are an organelle. They have ribosomes, but they have simpler and smaller ones. They do have a cytoskeleton, but it is smaller. And their cell walls are made of different substances, not cellulose. And this is the real big thing here. Eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles. All right. Everything else is also detailed. Like chromosomes come in pairs. We'll talk about that when we get into meiosis and mitosis. Organelles and other structures can stream through the cytoplasm. Mitosis is the process of division. All of the other structures, the flagella, the ribosomes, the cytoskeleton, are far more complex. They actually use cellulose in their cell walls, and cellulose is a carbohydrate. Just to bring us back to some of the stuff we've already talked about. All right, and that changes the structure of the cell wall, which changes how it interacts with other organisms. All right, so this is the real key thing, prokaryote versus eukaryote. Prokaryotic cells are far more simplistic. Prokaryotic cells are evolutionarily older. They have existed on this planet for far longer than eukaryotic cells have. And the only place you find prokaryotic cells anymore are in bacteria and archaebacteria. That's it. Every other cell on this planet is a eukaryotic cell, and yet still we're outnumbered by the prokaryotes, all right? And it's real important to understand that the key difference between pro and eukaryotic is whether they have membrane-bound organelles. The obvious difference is whether they have a nucleus, but the nucleus is a membrane-bound organelle. Next on our comparison of cells is an old school one that doesn't really fit because it's not just animals and plants, but it is something that we tend to stick to. Cells can be divided into two categories when they are eukaryotic. So this applies to eukaryotic cells, which, now that we know what those are, should have been obvious because they have organelles. But there's animals and plant cells. And what you'll notice, okay, is that down the middle here, I have all these organelles. And some of these are going to be familiar to you, some of these are not. But what you'll notice is they are in both animal and plant. And then what you'll notice is that there are 3 organelles over here that are in plant cells but not animal cells. And that's a really important distinction. Plant cells have a cell wall. Animal cells do not. Plant cells have a chloroplast or several chloroplasts. Animal cells do not. And plant cells generally have large central vacuoles. Now, animal cells can have them, but they're just not as big. And so that's the big thing. You can see right here, all these organelles, mitochondria, lysosome, endoplasmic reticulum, cell membrane, Golgi apparatus, peroxisomes, nucleus, cytosol, cytoskeleton, they can be in all types of eukaryotic cells. But cell walls, chloroplasts, and vacuoles tend to only be in plant cells, and so that tends to be what separates animal and plant cells. All right, so now what I want to do is I just want to bring up all of the different organelles. Now, I am not going to go through the details of all of these. In fact, what I'll do is I'll take this summary table and put it as a link on Edline. But I do want to talk about some of the key things here, okay? You want to be familiar with the structure and function of the general organelles, all right? A lot of this is review. It's not like we need a lot of detail, all right? But I just want to go through some of the basics. So every cell has a nucleus. The nucleus is responsible for genetic information. Frequently, you're told that the nucleus is the control center of the cell. That's because it contains blueprints on how to build the cell and operating instructions on how to run the cell. Ribosomes, this is probably one of the most important things in all of cells, are responsible for protein synthesis. Ribosomes are not membrane bound. See this column here where it has membrane and it says none? They don't have any. That's why you find ribosomes in prokaryotes as well. But ribosomes create proteins. So you know how we talked earlier when we did organic macromolecules? Proteins are involved in everything. Proteins are enzymes, proteins are structural, proteins just make everything in cells that do jobs. Well, something has to build those proteins, and that something is the ribosomes. Something has to have plans for those proteins, and that something is the nucleus. There also are several structures. We call them the endomembrane system, and they include the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Ribosomes tend to be attached to the rough ER, so protein synthesis. The Golgi apparatus says protein processing, but one of the big things, the ways we typically describe this, is that it ships things throughout the cell. So it actually like sends proteins to the places they need to go. Sometimes it'll send them out of the cell. In fact, those neurotransmitters your neurons give off into the synapse, those neurotransmitters are in packaging that's from the Golgi apparatus. And then you also have the smooth ER, which is also involved in synthesis, but this is also lipids. So when your body needs to make fat, say for fat storage, your body needs to make fat because it needs to make a hormone. Your body needs to make fat because it needs to make cholesterol. That's what the smooth ER is for. Lysosomes, peroxisomes are an interesting organelle here. So lysosomes and peroxisomes. Both of these are actually used for digestion. All right. And see how this says oxidation? That actually means breaking down. All right. So lysosomes and peroxisomes are actually how your body breaks down things it needs to get rid of. So not your body, your cells. So for instance, when your macrophages take in a bacteria to destroy, they attack it with lysosomes or peroxisomes. When an amoeba needs to eat a bacteria for dinner, It brings it inside, just like your macrophages, infuses it with lysosomes and peroxisomes to destroy it. All right, they're basically, it's kind of a weird thing, but they're highly destructive sacs. And they're used to destroy things that the cell wants to eat or digest. They're also used for cell suicide. Sometimes a cell wants to destroy itself in a controlled way, and that's what they're for. Vacuoles are a similar structure to lysosomes and peroxisomes, and they're used for storage. A lot of animal cells have smaller vacuoles that they store stuff in. Plant cells tend to have a gigantic central vacuole that holds water. The mitochondria and chloroplasts are two of the single most important organelles. All right, I'm sure you've definitely heard of them before. They really boils down to this. The mitochondria does cellular respiration. I know we talked about this when you did digestion, but cellular respiration generates the majority of energy for living things. And so every cell has its own mitochondria that generates energy. Plant cells also have chloroplasts, which undergo the process of photosynthesis, which creates sugar. And that process of creating sugar is then used by mitochondria for cellular respiration. The cytoskeleton does a bunch of things. It's structural support, but it also creates like a molecular highway so things can get through the cell pretty quick. And then you have the plasma membrane and the cell wall. These are outer coverings. The plasma membrane is frequently, you can refer to it as sort of a doorway. It controls what gets in and out of the cell. And in fact, we use this term here, selectively permeable. It chooses what can pass through it. And then finally, we have the cell wall. The cell wall is a rigid structural component. In fact, it's the cell walls in plants that allow them to stand up straight, even though they're soft. It's the cell walls in plants that eventually become things like the wood in tree bark. Okay, it's what gives plants a rigid or a strong outer covering because plants don't have skeletons to provide that support. All right. And so those are the basic organelles. I honestly do believe that this is a lot of review for you, which is why I'm sort of moving through it quickly. And obviously we're supplementing it with the guided reading that you were doing in class. So you have all of your organelles. You have the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes and the difference between plant and animal cells.